dark waters glide silently through the jungle. Beneath the seemingly calm surface, treacherous currents await. On the banks covered by dense vegetation, each movement can mean danger. This is Vietnam, and its rivers hold secrets that have transformed the course of one of the most complex wars of the 20th century. As the world debated military ideologies and strategies, thousands of young American soldiers discovered that their greatest adversary did not wear uniforms, carry conventional weapons, and cannot be defeated with technological superiority. It was nature itself, manifested through rivers that cut the country from north to south, turning into scenarios of unimaginable trials. When we think of the Vietnam War, we usually conjure up images of helicopters flying over jungles, fighting in villages or rice fields turned into zones of confrontation. We rarely stop to consider that much of this war was fought over murky waters, in small boats, or during crossings that tested the limits of the human body and mind. Vietnamese rivers were not just geographical obstacles. They were complete ecosystems of threats, where every dive, every boat pass, or every attempt to establish positions on the margins meant confronting dangers that the military manuals had never adequately predicted. The story you are about to learn has not been told often in conventional history books. It is a narrative constructed from veteran accounts, declassified documents, military medical records, and research conducted decades after the end of the conflict. It is the story of how water, an essential element of life, has become one of the deadliest forces faced by an entire generation of American soldiers abroad. Before we continue this journey through the deadly rivers of Vietnam, I would like to make a quick request. If this content is adding value to your knowledge, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving in the comments the time you are watching this documentary. Your interaction helps us to continue producing in-depth content like this. The Mekong Delta stretches over approximately 40,000 square kilometers of Vietnamese territory. It is one of the most extensive delta regions on the planet, where the Mekong River fragments into countless canals, streams, and waterways before emptying into the South China Sea. Conventional warfare operations, developed for European terrain or Middle Eastern deserts, simply did not apply to a territory where the distinction between land and water often disappeared. American soldiers came from a country where rivers usually meant defined borders, obstacles that could be crossed by bridges or bypassed by alternative routes. In Vietnam, they discovered that rivers were the very fabric of territory, impossible to avoid or ignore. More than that, they found that their opponents possessed centuries of knowledge about how to utilize these waterways, turning every meander, every tributary, and every flooded area into potential trap or escape route. The first major threat soldiers faced in dealing with Vietnamese rivers was something that no military training could adequately prepare for: waterborne diseases. Leptospirosis, caused by bacteria of the genus Leptospira, became one of the most common and debilitating afflictions among troops operating in riverside areas. These bacteria are eliminated in the urine of infected animals, mainly rodents, and can survive for weeks or months in fresh water, especially in hot, humid environments like Vietnam. A soldier crossing a river or simply wetting his feet in contaminated water was at risk of infection. The bacteria penetrate through small cuts, scratches, or even through intact skin if exposed for a prolonged time. The initial symptoms of leptospirosis are misleading, resembling a common flu: fever, muscle aches, severe headache. Many soldiers initially ignored these signs, attributing them to tiredness and general conditions of combat. However, if left untreated, the disease can progress to severe forms, affecting the kidneys, liver, central nervous system, and lungs. In its advanced stages, leptospirosis can cause jaundice, kidney failure, hemorrhages, and, in extreme cases, lead to death. Military medical records reveal that thousands of American soldiers contracted leptospirosis during their operations in Vietnam. Treatment required specific antibiotics and often medical evacuation from combat areas. For units operating in remote regions of the Mekong Delta or along the Saigon River, this meant reduction of effective combatant, not by direct enemy action, but by simple exposure to local water. Military commanders soon realized that they were fighting a war on two fronts: against human adversary forces and against microscopic pathogens that did not respect hierarchies or military strategies. In addition to leptospirosis, Another unseen adversary lurked in Vietnamese waters, schistosomiasis, also known as bilharziosis, caused by parasites of the genus Schistosoma. This tropical disease is transmitted through freshwater snails that act as intermediate hosts. The larvae of the parasite, called cercaria, are released into the water by snails and can penetrate directly through human skin during contact with contaminated water. The soldier does not even need to drink the water. Simply walking through a flooded rice paddy or swimming in a river can result in infection. Once inside the human body, the parasites migrate through the bloodstream until they reach the blood vessels that supply the intestine and bladder, where they mature and begin to produce eggs. It is the immune system response to these eggs that causes the symptoms of the disease: fever, fatigue, abdominal pain, bloody diarrhea, and in chronic cases, permanent damage to the liver, intestines, bladder, and other organs. Schistosomiasis was not only an immediate threat, it was a long-term sentence for many soldiers, whose symptoms could persist or resurface years after leaving Vietnam. Military medical protocols at the time had limited knowledge on how to deal with these large-scale tropical diseases. Many American military doctors, trained primarily to deal with combat injuries, were unprepared to diagnose and treat complex parasitoses. Campaign labs often lacked the equipment needed to accurately identify the pathogens responsible for the symptoms presented by soldiers. This resulted in incorrect diagnoses, inadequate treatments, and in some cases, serious complications that could have been avoided with appropriate intervention. Malaria, although not directly transmitted by water, found in the riverside areas of Vietnam its ideal habitat. Anopheles mosquitoes, vectors of malaria, proliferate in still waters and marshy areas that characterize much of the banks of Vietnamese rivers. During the monsoons, when heavy rains raised river levels and created countless puddles and flooded areas, the mosquito population exploded exponentially. Soldiers who set up camps near rivers, often out of tactical or logistical necessity, were exposed to swarms of mosquitoes during the hours of lower light, precisely when these insects are most active. Malaria caused by Plasmodium falciparum, the most severe form of the disease, became a constant concern for military commandos. Malaria outbreaks could incapacitate entire units, dramatically reducing operational capacity without a single shot being fired. Symptoms include high fever, intense chills, profuse sweating, severe headaches, nausea, and vomiting. In the most severe cases, malaria can progress to brain complications, kidney failure, respiratory problems, and severe anemia. Even with proper treatment, complete recovery takes weeks, during which time the soldier remains completely incapacitated for service. The malaria prevention strategy involved the regular distribution of antimalarial drugs, mainly chloroquine and subsequently mefloquine. However, the soldiers' adherence to these prophylactic regimes was inconsistent. Many young combatants, focused on the immediate and visible threats of the battlefield, neglected to take their pills daily. Others developed unpleasant side effects from the medications, including nausea, dizziness, and sleep disturbances, which led them to discontinue use. Some soldiers even shared the mistaken belief that once they had contracted malaria they would be immune to future infections, which does not correspond to the reality of the disease. But microbiological threats were only the beginning of the dangers posed by Vietnamese rivers. The very physical nature of these waterways presented deadly challenges. The currents of the Vietnamese rivers, especially during the monsoon season, could be surprisingly strong and treacherous. Rivers that seemed calm and navigable in certain stretches could suddenly present dangerous rapids or swirls capable of turning boats or dragging soldiers who tried to cross them on foot or by swimming. The Mekong River, in particular, had dramatic variations in flow throughout the year. During the dry season, between December and April, the river could significantly reduce its volume, exposing sandbars and making navigation difficult for deeper draft vessels. On the other hand, during the rainy season, between May and November, the same river could increase its volume by more than 10 times, transforming calm currents into violent torrents. Soldiers who relied on regular crossings or riparian operations constantly needed to adjust their tactics and equipment to changing conditions, an immense logistical challenge. Visibility in Vietnamese waters was another critical factor. Unlike the clear water rivers that many American soldiers knew from their homelands, the rivers of Vietnam, especially in the Mekong Delta, carry enormous amounts of suspended sediment. This natural turbidity makes the waters opaque, often brown or greenish in color, making it impossible to see what exists below the surface. For soldiers who needed to cross these rivers or operate vessels on them, this lack of visibility meant a constant state of uncertainty. Every step in the water could find a deep hole, a sunken root, a sharp object, or something much worse. Underwater traps represented an entirely new category of danger. The opposing forces, knowing the territory and its rivers intimately, developed sophisticated techniques to exploit the opacity of the waters as a tactical advantage. Sharp bamboo stakes were stuck into the riverbed at specific angles, designed to pierce the feet or legs of soldiers trying to cross on foot. These cuttings, often treated with contaminated substances to increase the risk of infection, were strategically positioned in likely passageways, near less steep margins or in seemingly shallow stretches. Barbed wire nets were stretched just below the surface of the water, invisible to anyone trying to cross by swimming or in small boats. These nets not only caused sharp injuries, but could also trap soldiers underwater, leading to drowning in a matter of minutes. In some cases, improvised explosive devices were fixed at strategic locations along rivers, triggered by trigger wires or pressure, exploding when vessels passed or when soldiers stepped on specific points during crossings. Veterans' documentation includes terrifying accounts of riverine patrols that suffered casualties not from direct confrontation, but from these underwater traps. A soldier could be crossing a river, carefully following his companion's trail ahead, when he suddenly screamed and disappeared under the water. His comrades, trying to rescue him, often entangled themselves in the same traps or triggered additional devices strategically positioned to catch the rescuers. The psychological anguish of seeing comrades injured or killed by invisible enemies, unable to identify or retaliate against those responsible, eroded the morale of the units more quickly than any direct confrontation. Vietnamese river fauna added another layer of threats. Poisonous snakes, particularly the cobra and the viper, were common in riverine areas. Some species of water snakes inhabited rivers and could attack if disturbed or threatened. For soldiers moving through the dense vegetation of the banks or crossing shallow waters covered by reeds, the risk of encountering snakes was constant. A venomous snake bite under normal conditions is already a serious medical emergency. Amidst the Vietnamese jungle, far from proper medical facilities and often under enemy fire, such a sting could easily become fatal. Saltwater crocodiles, native to Southeast Asia, although not extremely common in all operational areas, posed a real threat in certain stretches of Vietnamese rivers, especially in the areas closest to the coast and in the mangroves. These reptiles, which can reach impressive sizes of up to 6 meters in length and weigh more than 1,000 kilograms, are apex predators in their habitats. Crocodile attacks on humans, while relatively rare, are extremely dangerous due to the immense strength of their jaws and their behavior of dragging prey into deeper waters where they drown before consuming them. There are documented, though not abundant, reports of American soldiers encountering crocodiles during operations in Vietnam. The mere presence of these predators in the waters added another element of psychological terror to troops already overwhelmed with multiple threats. Swimming or wading through murky waters knowing that a predator of such magnitude could be present required a particular kind of courage or, in many cases, was simply a tactical necessity that did not allow for considerations of natural hazards. Sanguisugas were ubiquitous in Vietnamese waters, and although they presented no direct lethal risk, they caused significant discomfort and could transmit disease. These parasitic annelids attached to human skin using suction cups equipped with sharp structures, secreting anticoagulants that keep blood flowing while feeding. A soldier who spends any time in infested waters invariably comes out covered in leeches of various sizes, from tiny to surprisingly large. Proper removal of leeches requires specific technique to avoid leaving parts of the mouthpiece encrusted in the skin, which can lead to infections. In the heat of the military operation, with more urgent priorities, soldiers often removed leeches inappropriately, resulting in wounds that later infected. Trench foot, a medical condition known since World War I, has become endemic among soldiers operating in the riverside areas of Vietnam. This condition results from prolonged exposure of the feet to moisture, especially when combined with low temperatures, although it can occur in warmer climates. In the Vietnamese context, soldiers often spent days with their feet constantly wet, either by wading through flooded rice paddies, crossing rivers, or simply due to the intense monsoon rains. Prolonged exposure to moisture softens the skin of the feet, reduces blood circulation, and creates ideal conditions for bacterial and fungal infections. Trench foot symptoms include numbness, severe pain, swollen and discolored skin, blisters, ulcerations, and in severe cases, gangrene that may require amputation. Treatment requires drying your feet thoroughly, warming them gradually, and keeping them dry and clean for an extended period. For soldiers in active operations, especially those engaged in long-duration river patrol missions, keeping their feet dry was virtually impossible. Military boots, although designed for protection, retained moisture once wet, and there was insufficient opportunity or security to remove and dry them properly during operations in hostile territory. Military commandos eventually instituted specific protocols attempting to mitigate the trench foot problem, including more frequent unit casters in riverine operations, distribution of antifungal powders for preventive use, and foot care guidelines. However, the nature of operations in Vietnam often made strict implementation of these protocols impractical. Units could be stuck in positions for days with no possibility of rotation, or missions could extend beyond plan due to tactical conditions, leaving soldiers exposed to conditions of prolonged humidity with no alternatives. Riverine patrol operations, known by the acronym PBR, Patrol Boat River, have become one of the American military responses to the challenge posed by Vietnamese rivers. These fast, maneuverable vessels were specifically designed to operate in the narrow rivers and channels of the Mekong Delta. Equipped with multiple heavy machine guns and capable of speeds exceeding 40 kilometers per hour, PBRs allowed American forces to project power along waterways and interdict the transport of opposing supplies. However, operating these vessels on Vietnamese rivers was extraordinarily dangerous. The riverbanks were often densely vegetated, offering perfect cover for ambushes. A PBR navigating through a narrow channel could suddenly find itself under intense fire from multiple positions on the banks, with limited possibilities for maneuver or withdrawal. The shallow waters themselves and the presence of hidden sandbanks could cause vessels to run aground, making them vulnerable stationary targets. Water mines and floating explosive devices posed constant threats. Seemingly harmless objects floating in the water, tree trunks, or even ordinary containers, could be armed with explosives and set to detonate upon contact with the hull of a vessel. The characteristic speed of PBRs, while advantageous for tactical maneuvers, made it impossible to carefully examine each object in the water before passing through it. Crews developed a state of exhaustive hypervigilance, constantly scanning the waters ahead and the side margins, knowing that any lapse in attention could result in disaster. Operation Game Warden, begun in 965, was the systematic effort of American naval forces to establish control over the Mekong Delta's waterways. This operation involved hundreds of vessels of various types, including PBRs, riverine assault vessels, and more heavily armed river monitors. The goal was to interdict adversarial supply routes that used rivers to move weapons, ammunition, food, and other essential materials from controlled areas in the north to areas of operation in the south. During Operation Game Warden, U.S. forces conducted thousands of patrols, established floating checkpoints, and implemented roadblocks at strategic points along rivers. These operations resulted in the interception of significant amounts of adversarial supplies and the capture of numerous vessels and personnel. However, the human cost was considerable. Patrol crews faced not only adversarial fire, but also all other dangers inherent in Vietnamese rivers: diseases, nautical accidents, extreme weather conditions, and the psychological wear and tear of prolonged operations in a hostile environment. The monsoons completely transformed the character of riverine operations. During the rainy season, heavy rainfall could cause rivers to overflow their banks, flooding vast areas and creating new temporary waterways. Navigation became extremely dangerous due to reduced visibility, stronger currents, and floating debris that included everything from branches and entire tree trunks to displaced structures in riverside villages. The rains themselves, falling into dense curtains, severely limited visibility and made any outdoor activity miserable. For soldiers in fixed positions along rivers, Monsoons meant weeks of constant humidity. Equipment rusted, food deteriorated rapidly, and morale plummeted under the weight of incessant water. Moisture-related diseases proliferated, and simple maintenance tasks became monumental challenges. The constant rain also hampered radio communications, complicated air supply operations, and made it virtually impossible to medically evacuate injured people in many situations. The psychological aspect of operating on Vietnamese rivers cannot be underestimated. The fear of the unknown, constant and palpable, permeated every moment. Unlike a conventional battlefield, where the enemy eventually reveals itself and combat reaches some sort of resolution, Vietnamese rivers kept soldiers in a perpetual state of tension. Every ripple in the water could signal danger. Each shadow under the cloudy surface could be a trap or a predator. Every noise on the vegetation-covered banks could precede an ambush. Veterans who served in riverine operations often report that the psychological stress of these missions exceeded even direct combat. In conventional ground combat, there is some element of control, the possibility to seek cover, to fight back, to maneuver tactically. In rivers, especially for crews of smaller vessels, there was often only the vulnerability exposed and the hope that the next meander, the next stretch of river, would not hide the threat that would end it all. Isolation was another significant factor. Units operating in the remote areas of the Mekong Delta could spend weeks with limited contact with larger bases or other friendly units. The jungle and rivers created a sense of being completely disconnected from the outside world, plunged into an alien and hostile environment where the normal rules of existence did not apply. This isolation was amplified by the nature of the territory, where dense mangroves and riverine forests created impenetrable green walls that obscured any sense of direction or location. Night operations on the rivers presented unique and terrifying challenges. The complete darkness of the tropical jungle, without any light pollution, turned the rivers into invisible black ribbons. Navigating without lights, necessary to avoid becoming an easy target, required exceptional skill and intimate knowledge of the waterway. The nocturnal sounds of the jungle, amplified by water, created a cacophony of unknown noises that made it impossible to distinguish real threats from simple fauna. Each water plate could be an opposing soldier approaching silently or simply a fish leaping to the surface. The infiltration and exfiltration techniques developed by the special forces operating in Vietnam often depended on movements across or along rivers. U.S. Navy SEAL teams became experts in riverine and amphibious operations, utilizing the same rivers that presented so many dangers for their own tactical advantages. These teams developed deep respect for Vietnamese rivers and the dangers they posed, implementing strict safety and preparedness protocols before each mission. However, even with specialized training and proper equipment, SEAL teams were not immune to river hazards. Operational records document missions where teams have been compromised by waterborne diseases, where members have been injured by underwater traps, or where operations have had to be aborted due to encounters with dangerous wildlife. The professionalism and expertise of these elite units minimized risks, but did not eliminate them completely. The issue of drinking water for troops operating in riverside areas presented its own set of challenges. Although surrounded by water, this water was completely unfit for human consumption without extensive treatment. Drinking directly from Vietnamese rivers was almost certain guarantee of serious illness. Military forces relied on supplies of drinking water transported from bases or water purification equipment that were bulky, heavy, and often unsuitable for the demands of moving units. Dehydration became a constant risk, especially during operations under the intense heat and sweltering humidity of the tropical climate. Soldiers faced the paradox of being surrounded by water while simultaneously suffering from thirst. The additional weight of cantilas filled with drinking water made the already heavy equipment of the soldiers even more costly, but it was absolutely necessary for survival. Water rationing during prolonged operations was common, forcing soldiers to choose between immediate discomfort from thirst and preservation of limited supplies for future emergencies. The long-term effects of exposure to Vietnamese rivers manifested in many veterans' years or even decades after returning home. Untreated or inadequately treated parasitic diseases during service could remain dormant for years before causing severe symptoms. Veterans report developing chronic liver, kidney and gastrointestinal problems that doctors eventually traced back to exposure to pathogens during their service in Vietnam. The psychological trauma associated with river experiences also persists. Veterans describe recurring nightmares where they are back in the murky waters, again feeling the paralyzing fear of not knowing what lurks beneath the surface. Water-related phobias developed in many, with veterans avoiding swimming in lakes or rivers even decades later. The sound of heavy rain or the sight of dark waters can trigger vivid flashbacks, instantly transporting them back to those moments of terror in Southeast Asia. The medical and scientific community learned valuable lessons from the experience of American soldiers in the Vietnamese rivers. Epidemiological studies conducted during and after the war contributed significantly to the understanding of tropical diseases and their transmissions. Military medical protocols have been revised and improved based on the experiences lived in Vietnam, resulting in better preparation for future conflicts in tropical or subtropical environments. Military engineering has also evolved in response to the challenges posed by Vietnamese rivers. New underwater trap detection technologies have been developed, riverine vessels have been redesigned with improved explosion protections and improved maneuverability, and personal protective equipment has been adapted to better withstand tropical wet conditions. These innovations, born of desperate need on the Vietnamese battlefield, continue to influence the design of military equipment to this day. Vietnamese experience has definitely shown that modern wars are not fought with superior technology or brute force alone. The natural environment can be as formidable an adversary as any human military force. The rivers of Vietnam, with their multiple interconnected dangers, have taught a generation of American military personnel about the importance of understanding and respecting the terrain on which they fight. Ignoring the environment, treating it as a mere scenario for military operations, results in devastating human costs. The history of American soldiers and Vietnamese rivers is also a history of resilience and human adaptation. Despite all the dangers, tens of thousands of soldiers served in riverine operations, conducted patrols, established positions, and fulfilled their missions. Many have developed deep knowledge of rivers, learning to read their currents, identify potential hazards, and skillfully navigate through water mazes. This knowledge was often acquired through painful experience, with errors being paid for in blood and lives. Local Vietnamese communities, who had lived along these rivers for generations, possessed traditional wisdom about how to coexist with these dangerous environments. In some situations, American soldiers who have established respectful relations with local civilians have been able to learn about specific dangers of certain stretches of river, about seasonal patterns of waters, or about how to identify and avoid particularly dangerous areas. This exchange of knowledge, when possible, saved lives. The logistics of keeping military forces operating in remote riverine areas was a monumental undertaking. Supplies needed to be transported by boat, helicopter, or, in some cases, by precarious land routes through the jungle. The supply lines themselves became targets, and protecting them required deployment of significant resources. Riverside bases needed to be constantly replenished with ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, and, critically, drinking water. The financial cost of operating on the Vietnamese rivers was substantial. Specialized vessels were expensive to build and maintain. Equipment suffered accelerated wear and tear due to hostile environmental conditions. Medical treatments for the numerous diseases and injuries related to riverine operations represented significant expenses. These costs added to the already growing financial account of a war that stretched for years without clear resolution. Reflecting on the experience of American soldiers on Vietnamese rivers also leads us to consider broader questions about the nature of war and human suffering. Each statistic, each number of casualties, represents an individual with dreams, family, potential future. The young people who served in those rivers were students, workers, children, siblings. Many never returned home. Others returned physically, but carrying deep psychological wounds that would accompany them for the rest of their lives. The families of these soldiers also carried the weight of these experiences. Mothers, fathers, wives, and children lived with constant anxiety while their loved ones were in the combat zone. And for those who lost soldiers in the Vietnamese rivers, the pain of this loss persists through the generations. The communities of origin of these soldiers felt the impact, losing young people who could have contributed as teachers, doctors, engineers, community leaders. The narrative of the Vietnamese rivers is inseparable from the broader moral and political issues surrounding the Vietnam War. Regardless of individual political positions on the justification or execution of war, the human suffering experienced was real and profound. The soldiers who faced the dangers of the rivers did not choose the policies that put them there. They simply tried to survive and fulfill their missions in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Today, the rivers of Vietnam continue to flow, now in a country at peace. The same waters that have witnessed so much conflict and suffering now support fishing communities, irrigate rice fields, and serve as transport routes for peaceful trade. The traps were removed, the explosive devices neutralized, and nature slowly reclaimed the physical scars of war. However, the memories persist, kept alive by both veterans and Vietnamese families who also suffered immensely during that period. War memorials in the United States and Vietnam include names of many who perished not in epic fighting but in the silent waters of remote rivers. Some died of diseases they did not understand. Others drowned in murky waters or fell victim to invisible traps. Each name represents a unique story of sacrifice, and collectively they form a solemn testimony to the costs of war. Reconciliation between the United States and Vietnam in the decades following the end of the war included efforts to locate and repatriate the remains of missing American soldiers. Many of these missing were lost in the waters of the Vietnamese rivers. Search teams have faced the same dangerous environments, now on humanitarian rather than military missions, demonstrating that even in peacetime, rivers maintain their challenges and demand respect. Younger generations, both in the United States and Vietnam, now learn about this historical period through books, documents, and testimonies from veterans. It is crucial that the memory of these experiences be preserved not to glorify war, but to fully understand its human costs and, hopefully, inform future decisions about when and how to employ military force. The lessons of the Vietnamese rivers transcend military strategy. They speak about human resilience, about the price of conflict, and about our relationship with the natural world. As we wrap up this journey through the history of Vietnamese rivers and their deadly impact on American soldiers, we are reminded of the complexity of the war experience. It is not simply about winners and losers, heroism and cowardice. It is also about young people confronting realities for which no training could truly prepare them, about bodies and minds tested beyond their limits, and about the enduring weight that such experiences carry. Every river has its own story. The rivers of Vietnam tell stories of ancient civilizations, of communities that flourished along their banks for millennia. For a brief but intense period, these waters also witnessed a dark chapter of international conflict. The waters continue to flow, indifferent to the human dramas that unfolded in their currents. But those who lived these events will never forget. May we honor the memory of those who served, those who suffered, and those who never returned, keeping alive the truth of their experiences. May we learn from the past to build a future where such sufferings are avoided whenever possible. And may the Lord God bless all those who bear the scars, visible and invisible, of these distant waters, granting them peace, healing, and recognition for their sacrifice.